Okay, a little bit now about tissue level organization. This is chapter 4, right? Who's read? Yeah, chapter 4. Okay, very good. Sure, I'm on track. Tissue level organization, this is basically histology, study of basically tissue, but at a microscopic level, what goes on with the tissue. Now, in this process, we've been talking about the atomic level, the molecular level. Now the molecules are joining together and forming tissue structures. We'll talk about microscopic tissue, and then the next step is to get into the organ system. So following histology is the integumentary system, and we'll go through the integumentary system. We'll probably be able to enter into that today, and then we'll go into, we'll complete that next week. The epithelial tissue basically covers the exposed surfaces that lines the internal passageways in the chambers and forms glands throughout our body. Connective tissue basically fills internal spaces, provides structural support for other tissues, transports materials within the body, and stores energy reserves, as we've already talked about. Muscle tissue, specialized tissue involved in contraction, includes skeletal muscles in the body as well as muscles of the heart, the muscular lining of hollow organs. Now, skeletal muscle, different from cardiac muscle, different from smooth muscle. Cardiac muscle, we see where? In the heart. That's a gimme. Skeletal muscles, we see those muscles, those tissue structures are attached to bone, our bony framework that helps us to move, to locomote. And then there is smooth muscle that is in the linings of particular organs. The gastrointestinal tract, for example, has smooth muscles that allow the contraction of the colon. The blood vessels in our body have layers of smooth muscles that allow blood vessels to constrict and to relax or dilate. So muscle tissue, specialized for contraction, skeletal muscles of the body as well as muscles of the heart and muscular lining of hollow organs. And then another tissue, neural tissue, which carries information from one part of the body to another in the form of electrical impulses. There is epithelial tissue. It includes the surfaces of our skin, relatively familiar feature, and we'll go into a lot more detail about that in the coming lecture. Epithelial tissue includes epithelium and glands. Epithelial are layers of cells that cover the internal and external surfaces. Glands are structures that produce fluid secretions. I know we'll go into a lot more detail about that in the endocrine system. We will talk somewhat about glands. There are also glands involved in the integumentary system that we'll talk about as well. Epithelial covers every exposed surface of the body. Epithelial forms the surfaces of the skin that lines the digestive, respiratory, reproductive, urinary tracts. Basically, all the passageways that communicate with the outside are lined with epithelial tissue. This is an illustration out of your textbook that shows just the general structure of an epithelial cell. Now, all epithelial cells don't have all these similar cellular appendages that we see here. Basically, this illustration just shows you different types of surface appendages that can be on various types of epithelial cells. So I don't want you to think that every epithelial cell has all of these surface appendages. Cilia, microvilli, basically surface structures that either increase the surface area or or aid in the transport of different substances across the surface of epithelial cells. You see familiar structures such as Golgi apparatus, nuclear, mitochondria, depending on the epithelial cell that's involved and what its particular function is, determines the degree, the components that are inside the cytosol of these individual cells. Now, cells have to be connected. If we think about the epithelial of our skin, this is not one continuous cell. These are millions of cells that are stuck together. These cells are stuck together quite tightly by intracellular connections. You need to be familiar with the intracellular connections. They are tight junctions, gap junctions, desmosomes, and hemidesmosomes, all of which connect these epithelial cells a little bit differently, but the function of all of these cells, of all of these connections rather, is to hold each individual cell together. Tight junctions are formed by the fusion of outer layers of two cell membranes. Bands of tight junctions encircle the apical portion of many cells, preventing diffusion of fluids and solids between cells. Cells stick together. That's why when we pour water on our hand, it spills off onto the floor. It doesn't get into our body. Now, if you're soaking in water for prolonged periods of time, there is some exchange through the cell membrane over time. But basically, our skin cells are stuck together. When you suntan and then you peel days afterwards, your cells come off in sheets. They don't come off as each individual cell. You see sheets of cells because the tight junctions are so close together, adhere those cells so close together that when cells die and peel off, the tight junctions are still holding those individual cells together. Gap junctions basically permit free diffusion of ions and small molecules between two cells. Desmosomes have more organized network of these intermediate filaments. If you remember, we talked about internal structures. We talked about intermediate filaments. We'll talk a little bit more about them today. Desmosomes basically attach one cell to another, and a continuous belt of desmosomes lies deep to the tight junctions. This belt is tied to microfilaments in a portion of the cell referred to as the terminal web. And then the hemidesmosomes, again, intercellular connections. Hemidesmosomes attach to a cell extracellular structure such as protein fibers or basal lamina. So these epithelial cells have to stick, have to be held at a basement membrane or a basal lamina, and you'll see that in some subsequent pictures as we go along. So all tight junctions, you need to know what the all intercellular connections, tight junctions, desmosomes, hemidesmosomes, all of these structures hold cells together. That's their primary function. Now, different types of epithelial cells. Many of you who've already done your lab, been going over the lab, which I hope you have, so make all this go a lot better for you, is that there are many different types of epithelial tissue. There's different shapes, and you do need to know each of the different shapes. There is squamous epithelial, which is basically this flat. Simple epithelial, simple squamous epithelial, is just one cell deep, one epithelial cell deep. Stratified squamous epithelium, you see a number of these flat cells stacked upon each other. Simple squamous, one. Stratified squamous stacked upon each other. Cuboidal, shaped like a cube. Centrally lying nucleus, typically one single layer, simple cuboidal epithelium. And then stratified cuboidal epithelium, you see cuboidal cells are stacked on top of each other. Simple columnar epithelial, one tall columnar cell built like a column. That's where the name comes from. Stratified columnar epithelial cells are basically stacked on top of each other. Okay? Now, pseudostratified, which is not on this illustration, but pseudostratified epithelial tissue, pseudo means false. It means it looks like the columnar cells are stacked on each other, but really they're not. Actually, they all come down and they touch this basement membrane or this basal lamina, but it gives the appearance that they're stacked on top of each other. And we have some pictures of that coming up. Now, this is, yes? Question is this the type that typically has the cilia on it? And yes, it is. It's the type. What you've been studying in the lab has been pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelial. And yes, that's the type that typically has cilia on it. There are some cases where it doesn't, but for the purposes of this class, yes, it has a cilia on it. Usually found in the respiratory tract, can be found in the reproductive tract as well, and I'll go into that in just a little bit here now. Now, when we talk about simple and stratified squamous, simple stratified squamous, where is it located at? Mesothelial lining ventral body cavities, endothelial lining the heart, blood vessels, portions of the kidneys, tubules. We see this in the loop of Henle, which is a portion of the kidney. I won't go into a lot of detail about that because you have to take the A&P2 to really get into the details of the kidney. But if you see simple squamous epithelium, it gives you some idea where these structures are located at. Function basically reduces friction, controls vessel permeability, and also performs absorption and secretion. In stratified squamous epithelium, we see this is on the surface of the skin, lining of the mouth, the throat, the esophagus, the rectum, the anus, and the vagina. Basically, any area of the body that has contact with the external environment has stratified squamous epithelium. Its function provides physical protection against abrasion, pathogens, and chemical attack. On a test question, I may show you this slide that you see here, and I would say this type of epithelial tissue typically lies on the surface of the skin, or it lies in a body structure that has exposure to the external environment. Identify this tissue type. Stratified squamous epithelium. You will be counted wrong if you put simple squamous epithelium. And you have to be that specific because there are two different types of tissue. Okay? Simple squamous, we see that lining internal organs. You see it in the lungs. You see it in the loop of Henle. Stratified squamous epithelium, specific location, surface of the skin, lining the esophagus, tube that goes down, has exposure to external environment, rectum, anus, vagina, provides physical protection against abrasion, pathogens, and or chemical attack. So again, you have an illustration here that shows you the two cell types, simple squamous and stratified squamous. Stratified squamous epithelium, you do need to know this is from the skin. This would be the surface of the skin. You will have to know these layers when we talk about the integumentary system, and we will get into the integumentary system today and certainly next week, but you will need know these different layers. The surface, the stratum corneum, the stratum lucidum, the stratum granulosum, the stratum spinosum, the stratum germinativum, the basal lamina, and then the dermis. Lay people think this is the dermis. As you can see, the dermis is much further down in the deeper layers. You will need to know these different layers of the skin, and you'll have to be able to identify these. I'll go into more detail about them when we go into the... Only reason why I'm bringing them up now is because you might as well study that slide now because you will have to know it for the integumentary system. What's the structure of the epidermis? Portion of the epidermis, thick skin, showing a majority of stratified layers of epithelial cells. There are some other cells that are involved in the integumentary system as well at the dermis, and again, we'll talk about these more. Langerhans cells cannot be distinguished as standard histological preparation. These are special cells that are kind of used in the integumentary system, but I'll go into more detail about those in a bit. So for now, you can look over that. Cuboidal epithelium, cuboidal epithelial cells. Remember the one shaped like a cube. Section through the previous illustration showed a section through simple cuboidal epithelial cells. You see cuboidal epithelial cells for the purposes of your exam in kidney tubules, in the structure of the kidney. Again, the sectional view showing you stratified squamous epithelium was basically in sweat glands. Sweat glands are located in the skin. The lining of the empty urinary bladder shows a transitional epithelial tissue. Now, transitional epithelial tissue is a type of cuboidal tissue, but it has this ability to expand. This cuboidal epithelium, transitional epithelial tissue, basically can stretch as the bladder needs to stretch when it fills with urine, and then when contraction takes place and it urinates, it collapses on it. So transitional epithelial can stretch back and forth. A type of cuboidal epithelial, but specifically in the urinary bladder. So on the exam, if I asked you identify this cuboidal epithelial tissue located in the urinary bladder, you would have to give me transitional epithelium. You wouldn't be able to give me cuboidal epithelial because I gave you that in the question. Okay? Lining of a full bladder showing the effects of stretching and appearance of epithelial tissue. This is an example of simple cuboidal tissue. If I said this was in the renal tubule, not in the bladder, renal tubule, it's simple cuboidal epithelial. Glands, portions of the kidney tubules. Also, you see another gland, the thyroid gland, where it can be located at. Limited protection, secretion, and absorption. The key for you on cuboidal tissue is you know it's in the urinary tract. Now, that's the example I'm going to give you. When you take A&P2, you'll find out cuboidal tissue is actually in a number of other places inside the body. But for the purposes of this exam and this course, cuboidal epithelial, simple cuboidal, you know that's in the kidney tubule. Transitional epithelial tissue is located in the urinary bladder. Stratified cuboidal epithelium is located in some ducts. Ducts, protection, secretion, and absorption. Stratified cuboidal tissue, again, cuboidal cells stacked on top of each other, as you can see on this illustration. Now, you cannot appreciate the individual cuboidal cells. You certainly cannot discern the borders of each cell. What should tell you that this is stratified, though, number one, there's a lumen here, which means it's a duct, and the nuclei are stacked on top of each other. So this should tell you this is stratified cuboidal epithelium. Now, I obviously would have to give you more of a description. I would have to tell you this type of epithelial tissue is located in a gland in the body. This is the duct of that gland, the lumen of that gland. Identify this cell type. You should be able to tell me cuboidal epithelial tissue. Transitional epithelial tissue, as I alluded to earlier, located in the urinary bladder. It's a special type of cuboidal tissue. Identify this tissue. Your answer would be transitional epithelium tissue. I will take off for not spelling epithelium right. You got everything we're talking about today is epithelium or epithelium. Transitional epithelial tissue, okay, in the urinary bladder. Again, transitional. Each one of these cells touches the basement membrane, but it stretches. This is very stretchable tissue, again, because the urinary bladder has to fill with urine. Now, columnar epithelial tissue. Columnar epithelial tissue, as you saw in the illustration, tall, standing cells. Columnar epithelium, thickness of the epithelium and the location, orientation of the nuclei relative to its columnar shape. Typically, the nuclei are a little closer down toward the basement membrane. Simple columnar epithelial lines the small intestines. So when you see columnar epithelium, you'll know that we're talking about an intestinal tract. Pseudostratified columnar epithelial cells are located at two places. One, the respiratory center, because the cilia, when you breathe in foreign particles, viruses, bacteria, and or dust, the cilia, the little finger-like projections along the respiratory tract, has a mucus layer over the top of them. These particles get caught in the mucus, and the cilia, in a wave-like motion, throws it out of the system. Okay, so we see ciliated columnar epithelium, pseudostratified epithelium, in the respiratory tract. In the reproductive tract, when the sperm has to be moved along the vas deferens and out the ejaculatory duct, there is also cilia that lines the vas deferens. The cilia, in a wave-like motion, helps to propel the sperm, has to send the sperm down the male reproductive tract. In the female reproductive tract, when the eggs move along the fallopian tubes, there are also cilia inside the fallopian tubes. The cilia, in a wave-like motion, helps to move the eggs down the reproductive tract in the female. So, two areas where you see pseudostratified columnar epithelial tissue with cilia: reproductive tract, male or female; respiratory tract. Okay, so two areas where you'd see those types of cells at. Pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium in the respiratory tract. Pseudostratified ciliated epithelial tissue can be in some large ducts, salivary glands as well. Now, this is the illustration, histological slide. You'd have to be able to recognize, certainly you should know this gives you a columnar appearance. Each individual cell you can clearly see comes down to the point of the basal lamina. You see the prominent nuclei, you see the tall shape, and I would say this particular cell type is found in the intestinal tract. Identify the cell type. Simple columnar epithelial tissue. Now, I can be even more specific. I can say this particular cell type is located in the intestinal tract. Identify the surface appendage. Now, surface appendage here is microvilli. The purpose of microvilli, those of you who are doing the media will not benefit from this picture I'm drawing on the board. But I'm not talking to you, I'm talking to the media people. But this is microvilli. Okay, now, you see how much area is packed into this space. Now, the purpose of microvilli is to increase the surface area. So, if I take each end of this line and I stretch it out, it's now this long. So that's how much surface area I have for absorption. So microvilli, what it does is it increases the surface area so you have more area for absorption to take place. Absorption takes place everywhere here. So the more microvilli you have, especially when it's stacked in, go back to that illustration that I showed an epithelial tissue and it had cilia, had microvilli on it. Look at all the microvilli, how they're stacked in. It shows you how much surface area is available for absorption. Where is that important at? Important in the digestive tract. When you eat food, and you break food down into components, it has to be absorbed into our system. So any tissue that's involved in absorption needs microvilli. Microvilli increase the surface area. So simple columnar epithelium with cilia typically is located in the digestive tract. So if I would ask you this surface appendage, then you should be able to identify that as microvilli, not cilia. Not cilia. Where's cilia at? Cilia is in the respiratory tract. Cilia is in the reproductive tract. It's for movement. It's to move substances through that tract, either to move particles out of the respiratory tract or to move the sperm or to move the eggs through the reproductive tracts, respectively. So difference in cilia, difference in microvilli. If I show you this tissue, you know that it's columnar, and I tell you this is microvilli, then I'd ask you where is it located at. I would expect you to tell me the digestive tract. So see, I can ask that question a number of different ways, but you have to know the location, you have to know the function. Pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium, learn that word, learn how to spell it. Go back and tell your parents, tell your brothers, tell your sisters, they'll know you're really in school. Pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelial tissue located in the lining of the respiratory tract, so nasal cavity, trachea, some of the bronchial tubes, also in the male and female reproductive tracts. Okay, function, protection, and secretion. Again, if I would ask you, let me digress here just a second. Pseudostratified, why? Because it gives you the appearance. It gives you the appearance that the columnar cells are stacked on each other. There's my arrow. It gives you the appearance that these cells are stacked on it. You see a nuclei here, you see a nucleus here. So it gives you the impression that the columnar cells are stacked on each other. They're really not. It's a false appearance, the word pseudo. Actually, each cell overlaps each other, but each of the columnar cells come down and it touches the basal lamina. It also has cilia on the top of it. Pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. Again, same thing. I can say this particular type of cell is located in the respiratory tract. Identify this surface appendage. You should be able to tell me cilia. This particular cell type, ciliated, is located inside the respiratory tract. Identify this epithelial tissue. You should say pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelial tissue. Okay? Pseudostratified columnar epithelial tissue is located in what organ structure? Give me two examples. You should be able to tell me the respiratory system and the reproductive system. Okay? Everybody follow me? Very good. Stratified columnar epithelial tissue located in small areas of the pharynx, epiglottis, mammary gland, salivary glands, urethra. Function as protection. Again, you can see these obviously are stacked on top of each other. This is stratified columnar epithelium. These cell fibers are connective tissue. Connective tissue is basically the filler, connective tissue proper. As you can see, it's a smorgasbord of cells that are packed in here, macrophages that are used in the immune system, melanocytes which give color to our skin, reticular fibers which help give structure, adipocytes, fat cells which give us protection, bulk, help generate heat, protection, some ground substance or filler, fibroblasts, structural components that help in recovery of cell injury, collagen fibers again which give us structure, and elastic fiber which gives us compliance, resilience as well. Mesenchyme, this is embryonic connective tissue, first connective tissue that appears in developing embryo. Mesenchyme contains an abundance of star-shaped stem cells, mesenchymal cells separated by a matrix of very fine protein filaments. Mesenchyme gives rise to all other connective tissue. Remember, it has the stem cells. Anybody see the special they had about stem cells on Nightline? this argument that I make all the time about these companies that tell you to, you're going to have a baby, you need to save the embryonic stem cells so you don't get cancer. So if your baby gets cancer, you can treat it. And they say you pay $100, pay $1,500 up front. They save your baby stem cells from the umbilical cord. You guys familiar with that at all? No people are not. Yeah. If you have a baby, babies have stem cells, an abundance of stem cells. A lot of stem cells are in the umbilical cord that goes to the placenta of the mom. And so you can use stem cells, they use it in research, but it's also thought that you can use stem cells to help prevent cancer. Or if you get cancer, you can use the stem cells in the bone marrow, so you don't have to get bone marrow transport. You're using your own stem cells, and when you go through these processes of chemotherapy, kills all your bone marrow, you can have your own bone marrow transplanted. Sounds great, but will that really happen? You stand a greater chance of winning the lottery than using your own stem cells later in life for cancer. But these companies are up now, and they send you this nice little pamphlet, and don't you want to protect your baby's future, and you should do this for your child. And so a lot of people are signing up, and they're storing their baby stem cells, and they're sitting in these freezers and will sit there forever and a day. And you pay an annual fee, depending on the company, runs anywhere from $150 to $1,000 a year to store the stem cells that you hope that your child will never need. But you're buying an insurance policy, is how it advertises. And again, the chances of your child needing those stem cells in life are little to none. Now, some individuals have a child already with a form of cancer and is undergoing therapy. They have a second child. They use the second child's stem cells to treat the other child, which, depending on your ethnic belief or ethical nature, whether or not you think that's appropriate or not, I don't have a problem with it, especially if you want to have more children. But by and large, these companies are out there, and they're kind of milking the public off of the fear of a disease that may or may not ever happen. And then all institutions can't use stem cells. It's not traditional therapy. Most insurance companies won't pay for it either, and so you kind of got these stem cells and you can't use them. But anyway, in the tissue of newborns, and my point being, the mesenchyme, embryonic connective tissue, appear to be, this is in the developing embryo, has an abundance of star-shaped stem cells. Mesenchyme basically is utilized to give rise to all other forms of connective tissue inside the embryo. Mesenchymal stem cells, adults have neither form of embryonic tissue. However, many adults' connective tissue contains scattered mesenchymal stem cells that can assist in tissue repair and injury. Now, we do have stem cells in the integumentary system because, remember, there's a rapid turnover of cells in the integumentary system. We need new cells generating in the integumentary system all the time, especially for injury and repair. Histological slide of mesenchymal cells. Loose connective tissue, basically the packing material that you see in cells, fills spaces between organs, cushions, stabilizes, specializes cells, many organs, and supports other epithelial structures. Loose connective tissue that surrounds and supports blood vessels, nerves, stores lipids, provides roots for diffusion of material. Loose connective tissue includes mucous connective tissue in embryos, areola tissue, adipose tissue, reticular tissue in adults. Loose connective tissue. Adipose tissue you should be able to recognize. Very obvious type of cell here. You actually cannot see the cells themselves. You can see the connective tissue between them, but the adipocytes themselves don't take up stain very well. Typically, there has to be a special stain involved to be able to see adipocytes, so I do have some slides demonstrating special stains. I'll typically show you this one, and then I may show you some of the specialized stains on a test question. Basically, though, if you know the location and function, from the location and function, you should be able to give me the correct answer for the slide even without seeing the slide. If I told you this particular cell type provides padding, provides insulation, cushions from shock, insulates, reduces heat loss, stores energy reserve, identify this cell type. Should be a given. Location, deep to the skin, especially at the side, the buttocks, breast, padding around the eyeball. I could also ask you, identify this cell type. Give me one example of a function of this cell type. and you would go to provide padding, cushioning, shocks, insulates, reduces heat loss. That's more than one example, but you get the point. Also for reticular tissue. Where do we see reticular tissue? We see it in the liver. We see it in the spleen. Any type of solid organ, you'll see reticular tissue. Other examples, it's in the bone marrow, lymph nodes, functions to provide a supporting framework. Not to be confused with bone, which also provides a supporting framework, but the comparisons when you look at the histological slides are grossly different. This is reticular tissue. Reticular tissue. This is dense regular connective tissue. I usually don't give this on an exam because it looks like smooth muscle, but dense regular connective tissue located between skeletal muscles. So we see it used as tendons, aponeurosis, which makes it a fair game question because if I use the example of tendons, you know this is dense regular connective tissue. Function: provides firm attachment, conducts, pulls muscles, reduces friction between muscles, stabilizes relative positions of muscle to bone. Dense irregular connective tissue, as you can see, is a smorgasbord of mixed tissue. Irregular in shape. There's no homogeneity here at all. You see that these cells are basically cross-laid in different areas. Capsules of visceral organs, the pericardium, the nerve, muscle sheets, dermis, provides strength, resists forces applied to many areas. Again, this is tough. It prevents overexpansion of certain structures. Urinary bladder, for example, can only expand to a certain degree. Elastic tissue, again, elastic tissue, and as you've seen previously with dense regular connective tissue, typically causes too